All right, welcome to our last plant talk of the spring semester. We have Ariel today, who's going to be graduating with her PhD shortly, at the end of the semester. She's worked on a diversity of agricultural topics and had a little foray into some pine rockland soils as well. Today she's talking about legume cover crops and carambola. So I leave it to you, Ariel.
Okay, thank you. Can I get screen share capability, please? All right,
Yes.
there we go. Thank you. Okay, so it's great to have you all here today. Thank you for attending. Today I'm going to talk to you about tropical leguminous cover crops as a fertilization strategy for Averrhoa carambola. And this talk is kind of a section of some of my dissertation that I'll be talking to you about today. So if you're not familiar with agriculture or cover crops, I just wanted to give a brief intro to what a cover crop is. So a cover crop is a plant that you would plant not really for a saleable crop like corn or tomato, but more to grow and to reduce erosion on your soils. And then you might use it also as a green manure to incorporate back into the soils to add green manure, organic matter. So again, it would reduce erosion, increase soil water holding capacity. There's a bunch of a variety of benefits that cover crops can add to the soil, also reducing nutrient leaching, which is a huge problem in agriculture. And if the crop is leguminous, it can also fix nitrogen in the soil and add nitrogen through that green manure material. So based on what the farmer's goal is, they can look at a variety of species of cover crops and decide which ones they want to plant to satisfy their main objective, whether it be weed suppression or nitrogen additions, or whatever else, pollinator attraction. There's a variety of benefits that these cover crops provide. So they should be easy for the farmer to manage and not compete with either their intercropped species like a fruit tree or the subsequent vegetable production. And also they should be pretty easy to maintain and also perform well in stressful conditions and be established with minimal inputs. So I wanted to give a brief introduction about the tropical fruit industry in Miami-Dade County. So if you're not aware, Miami-Dade County and South Florida is pretty much the only place in the contiguous United States that has a tropical fruit production industry other than Hawaii. And that's because we have the climate that's conducive for this fruit production. So in Miami-Dade County, 33% of the cultivated crop sales are from tropical fruits. And so I was interested in learning more about tropical fruit production. And I was thinking, okay, what kind of sustainable practices can we incorporate or study that could be beneficial for these farmers that grow tropical fruits? So I thought cover cropping could be a good addition to add organic matter to our calcareous soils. And I also was looking at the stats and I saw that, you know, not many farmers in Miami-Dade County cover crop, only about 3%. And those are generally vegetable producers, as this is like a mainstream practice for people who produce vegetables, but it's not, and not even been very much researched for those who produce fruit. So I thought it would be interesting to try to see if cover cropping would be useful for this type of production. So the study area is the Redland Agricultural Area. Probably most of you know this is in South Miami, and it boasts a subtropical climate in plant hardiness zone 10B. And because, you know, most of us live in South Florida, we know that we have a very wet summer season, very hot and wet, and a drier type cooler winter season. So with that, summer is generally the best time to plant cover crops because of those longer days inspire more vegetative growth. And also, little to no irrigation is needed based on the amount of precipitation that we get in the summer. So, like I was saying before, low inputs are better, especially for the farmer who's managing these cover crops. And then I want to talk a little bit about the soils in the Redlands. So if you're familiar with South Florida, you know that we have this calcareous soil that's from a limestone parent material, and it's also not very well developed. We have a very shallow soil profile, especially in natural areas like Pine Rockland and places like that. So due to this shallow, undeveloped soil, most farmers incorporate a practice called rock plowing. So this is when they use a rock plow or big machine to crush up that limestone rock, and that's in order to create enough room in the soil profile for root establishment. So with that rock plowing, as you would probably think, the soil is very gravelly, it's very rocky, and it's high in those carbonate rock fragments, and because of that, it's very alkaline. It's also very low in organic matter. So that's kind of one of the reasons I really thought that applying these cover crops to this very rocky soil, low organic matter soil could have like a high impact for this fruit production. So to introduce the two cover crops I'll be talking about today, the first one is called sun hemp. They're both going to be legumes. So this is a very fast growing leguminous cover crop, and it has a tall growth habit. As you can see here, it can get to up to 2 meters tall, and it has a very fibrous stem with leaves coming all the way down. And it can flourish in a variety of soil conditions, which is good for us in South Florida because we have those alkaline, low nutrient soils. And they're also fairly drought tolerant. So that's also a great characteristic for a farmer as well. The main point where they need a lot of water would just be the germination time. So this is a very great cover crop because it has the potential to produce a lot of dry biomass in a 60-day growing period, and also produces a lot of nitrogen in its plant material. And that's because it is a legume. It does fix nitrogen, which is beneficial for the soil and the surrounding plants, but also for retaining nitrogen within that plant material. And my second cover crop that I studied is called velvet bean, and it kind of has an opposite growth habit of sun hemp. It's very vigorously vining and it has large leaves. This is also a tropical plant, and it also grows well in a variety of soil types, varying pHs, low nutrients. It's also pretty drought tolerant like sun hemp. The biggest difference besides the growth habits is that it has 120 to 330 day life cycle, so a little bit longer than the sun hemp. However, and it does take a little bit longer to establish itself, but it does still have the potential to produce a large amount of dry biomass within a 60-day growing period like sun hemp. So again, the reason that I picked these two cover crops to study is because sun hemp and velvet bean have been shown based on some previous research that has been conducted in the Redland to produce a lot of biomass and total nitrogen within its plant material when compared to other tested cover crops. And also were shown that their green matter additions can also increase fruit yield for tomatoes compared to the fallow treatment and other cover crop treatments. So I thought that was interesting and very convincing to try with tropical fruits. So for my experimental site, I used a 15-acre multi-use certified organic farm. So this farm grows a lot of different types of tropical fruits. But this section here was the section I was able to utilize, and it had 2 rows of juvenile carambola. So these trees were about 3 years old when I started my project. They were Hawaiian super sweet variety grafted onto golden star rootstocks, which is the traditional rootstock for Carambola. There were 62 trees in those 2 rows, and they were transplanted about a year before I started my study, so when they were 2 years old. And the beds were 122 meters long with 3.8 meters tree to tree. So as for the experimental design, I had 2 cover crop growing seasons. So the project lasted about a year and a half, and the growing seasons were 90 days in the summer of 2018 and 2019. So we had about a 33% coverage of the cover crops in this area. So that would be 33% per hectare, basically. So if you were growing for vegetable production, you would have 100% coverage, but based on, you know, the tree spacing and equipment that's being used in the field, you have to limit the coverage. And we planted directly around each tree. So I had 6 treatments here. If you look at these acronyms, these will be consistent throughout the PowerPoint. So the first one is F for fallow. Then we have the fallow. So this was fallow with no cover crop. So it was just the Carambola tree. Then we had the fallow plus manure treatment. So I utilized chicken manure or poultry manure in this study because that was the fertilization strategy that the farmer was using and is traditional for tropical fruit growers that grow organically to use certified organic poultry manure for fertilization. So I used a 5-3-2 poultry manure, and that was applied every 2 months for the treatments that had it. So for this FM is the fallow plus manure treatment, so no cover crop, but that poultry manure addition. SH for sun hemp, so just the sun hemp treatment. SHM for sun hemp with poultry manure. VB for velvet bean, and VBM for velvet bean plus poultry manure. So the way that we planted these cover crops, we had an 8.8 meter squared area of cover crop planting. The tree was in the middle and it had a 50 centimeter radius around it where no cover crops were planted. And then we had these concentric circles in which we seeded evenly to make sure that the plants were evenly dispersed throughout this sampling area. So this was the graphic for sun hemp, and this was the graphic for velvet bean. The velvet bean seeds were a lot larger, so there was fewer planted. But this, you can see the schematic. And here you can see we use the completely randomized design to decide, you know, where the treatments for each tree would be. And I wanted to show a little bit about the preparation for this project. So we had to be very careful when preparing the land because, as you know, we do have that shallow soil profile even with the rock plowing. So, you know, most everything that's planted here, especially the trees, have very shallow feeder roots that could be easily, you know, messed with if there was a lot of tillage going on. So we hand tilled every single plot, as you can see here. And then as far as the seeding goes, you can see those concentric circles we made based on those measurements. And then this was what it looked like 90 days after germination. So here you can see there was a lot of vegetative growth. This is what the velvet bean looked like around the Carambola tree. And this is what the sun hemp looked like. This is the termination process. And here you can see 90 days after growing, this was right after termination. And here you can see what the velvet bean looked like when it was terminated and what the sun hemp looks like when terminated. We did, like I was saying, we didn't till. So this green manure was basically chopped and dropped, and it was left on the soil surface in a no-till fashion to decompose. So this project I'm going to present in like 2 parts of analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about the soil nutrients, and then we'll talk about the plant response. So to begin with the soil nutrient analysis, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sampling scheme. So in the field, we collected composite soil samples from the area around each tree before planting, at termination, and every 2 months following. And we also had the in-field soil readings, mostly to quantify ambient conditions like temperature, moisture, EC, and those were every 2 weeks during the growing season and once a month after termination. And then for the laboratory methods, or what we actually measured, we measured the soil moisture content, organic matter, total carbon and nitrogen, and soil available, plant available soil nutrients like nitrate, nitrite, and ammonia. So to get into the results, this slide is broken into season 1 and season 2. So you can see all the cover crop biomass data. And again, these acronyms are going to be the same throughout the PowerPoint. So as for the biomass produced by these cover crops, as we can see, both in season 1 and season 2, sun hemp produced more cover crop biomass than the velvet bean, which was also coinciding with other studies that had been conducted. So sun hemp produced up to 63% more biomass in season 1 and up to 77% more biomass in season 2 than the velvet bean treatments. And also, as you can see, season 2 was less successful in biomass production overall than season 1, which may have had to do with some weather factors or external factors. As for the nitrogen content contributed by these cover crops, the sun hemp treatment contributed more total nitrogen than velvet bean treatments throughout the experiment in season 1 and in season 2. Sun hemp treatments produced up to 67% more nitrogen than the velvet bean treatments. And as far as total carbon goes within the plant material, again, sun hemp produced more total carbon than velvet bean, and that can be attributed to those long fibrous stalks that you saw. But this corresponds again with the carbon to nitrogen ratios of the plant material. So as you can see, the sun hemp material had higher carbon to nitrogen ratios while the velvet bean had lower. So it's probable that the velvet bean was more highly degradable than the sun hemp biomass. And lastly, I wanted to point out the shoot dry matter in the weeds. So as we can see during the growing seasons, these cover crops did do a very good job at suppressing weeds compared to the fallow treatments, as weeds were up to 81% higher in these fallow treatments than the cover crop treatments. So I also wanted to point out the weather patterns here. First, this red line we can see is the rainfall. And here we can see, as I was saying before, we have that higher rainfall during the summer months and lower in the winter and spring months, and then picks up again in the summer. Also, as you can see here, cover crops were planted in May for both seasons, or late April, early May. And in this cover crop growing season, the first one, we had a lot more rainfall than in the second growing season where the seeds were established, which could have played a role in cover crop establishment and maybe how much biomass was produced in season 2 versus season 1. Additionally, I wanted to point out here the air temperature. So here we can see in the summer months, obviously the temperature is higher and then it dips down in the winter months, which can be kind of interesting when we talk about the Carambola tree and its features. So here we have that dip down, especially in January. And again, we see temperature dropping in the winter months in the second year as well. So as for the soil chemical attributes, when we look at soil electrical conductivity, we really didn't have any difference between treatments when we looked at it season by season. This may have had a short-term effect, but when we look at the data this way, there was really no significant difference. When we look at the pH, This was kind of what we were expecting to see, slightly to moderately alkaline soils throughout the experiment based on that limestone parent material. We see that the fallow treatment, or the F treatment, had the highest soil pH, and that's most likely based on not having additions of organic matter to acidify the soil a little bit. And when we look at the soil organic matter, for season 1, the sun hemp with manure treatment accumulated the highest soil organic matter. And for season 2, we saw the fallow manure and the sun hemp treatment with the highest organic matter. In both cases, the fallow treatments had the lowest organic matter. And then when looking at soil total carbon and total nitrogen, the sun hemp with manure and the fallow with manure treatments had the highest total carbon and total nitrogen overall in season 1, while the fallow treatments had the lowest. And in season 2, the fallow manure treatments was highest overall in total carbon and nitrogen, and that was followed by both the sun hemp treatments. So these results were also reflected in the soil carbon to nitrogen ratios, as we can see here, especially for season 2. The fallow manure and sun hemp treatments had the lowest carbon to nitrogen ratios, along with the velvet bean with manure treatments. But the data, we really see more of a response when we're looking at plant available nitrogen. So here we're looking at ammonia, and ammonia is interesting because it is the first step in the nitrogen cycle. So it has a pretty quick turnover rate, which ultimately controls the amount of the greater quantity of plant available nitrogen we see, like nitrates. So here we can see that this line here is water-filled pore space, and we can see that the ammonia is pretty well correlated with the amount of water-filled pore space we have as well. So at this first sampling period, so this is August 2018, this was right at cover crop termination, 2 months after, 4 months, 6 months, and 8 months after termination. And again, this was right when cover crops were being planted again. And then here, this was at the second termination, and then it goes 4 months out, basically. So for that August 18 sampling time, the soil ammonia was highest for the sun hemp with manure treatment, up to 47% higher than that fallow treatment. And here you can see the sun hemp treatment was also pretty high there. And this can be also attributed to nitrogen fixation, as this was before any of the manure was actually applied. And at this December 18 sampling time, we see that sun hemp had the highest ammonia compared to velvet bean treatments and the fallow with manure treatments. And at this April 19 sampling time, the velvet bean with manure treatment had the highest ammonia, and the other treatments were lower. But overall, when looking at all the data, regardless of sampling time, there was no significant difference between treatments in ammonia, and that again could be due to that high turnover rate within the soil. So when looking at soil nitrate and nitrite, so this is a combined reading since nitrate is generally the bigger amount and a small amount of nitrite exists. So when looking at this at individual sampling times, that October 18 sampling time, 2 months after cover crop termination, the velvet bean had significantly higher nitrate and nitrite, followed by the sun hemp, and all the other treatments lower. And then here at this April 19 sampling time, we see that the sun hemp with manure had the highest nitrate nitrite content, followed by the velvet bean with manure. You can see all the manure treatments were higher than the non-manure treatments. So at this point, 8 months after termination, there was probably a lot of degradation in that cover crop material. So that manure was really supplementing for the carambola trees there. And then at September 19 sampling time, the velvet bean with manure treatment had the highest soil nitrate content. And then when we look at the November 19 and December 19 sampling time, soils treated with the sun hemp with manure had the highest nitrate content when compared to all other treatments. So it seems from this data that the velvet bean is better at providing short-term available nitrogen, while the sun hemp is better at providing more long-term, like a couple months after available nitrogen. So overall, with all times considered, the sun hemp and the sun hemp with manure treatment had the highest nitrite averages out of all the treatments measured. So now to look a little more at the carambola tree response to these treatments, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the carambola tree. So this is a tropical fruit tree. It's native to Southeast Asia, so it's truly tropical, small to medium in height, and it has its peak blooms in May and September, so that's when it's flowering, and peak fruit harvest times in August through October and December through January. So the mature tree requires 90 to 270 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen per year. And carambola isn't a super popular crop to be grown commercially in South Florida. However, we are seeing an increase in farmers adopting this crop based on switching out for avocado. As maybe some of you know, laurel wilt over the past probably 10, 15 years has been ravaging the Southeast and has been, killing a lot of the avocado trees. But carambola has the potential for $24,000 in gross revenue per acre per year. So it is a good option as an alternative crop. Some of the biggest issues with carambola is that it needs to be supplied with micronutrients because of the calcareous soil conditions. And it really needs zinc, manganese, and iron. So those are the nutrients that they're usually lowest in without, foliar sprays. And then another thing about it is because it's a truly tropical tree, it does have effect of the leaves in winter months. So this is the phonology of carambola. So as you can see, it starts having a reduced amount of development starting in October when the weather starts becoming cooler, and that runs around through March. So at this point, we see actual leaf chlorosis, defoliation, and lack of growth. Carambola actually can grow continuously all year round in its native habitat, but when it gets cooler, it reduces its growth rate a lot in South Florida. So around March, we see that root flush, and around April, we see a spike in the vegetative flush once it becomes a lot warmer. And that runs through the summer months. So as for the methodology to measure plant health, we looked at SPAD readings in the field, so basically leaf greenness, and we chose 5 mature leaves per tree every 2 weeks during the growing season and once a month after termination. We also harvested the fruits to measure marketable fruit yield every 2 weeks throughout the harvest season, and we measured carambola leaf total carbon and nitrogen. And in addition to that, we thought it would be interesting to kind of incorporate a remote sensing aspect to the project. So working with the GIS Center and the library, we had drone flights every 2 months. So the crew would come out and set up their UAV with a Red Edge M multispectral sensor, and they were able to fly over the site and collect images in which we were able to get very high resolution, 3 to 4 centimeter resolution maps of the site. So you can see that here. So this is around 1,000 images stitched together to get that resolution, which we do in Pix 4D software From there, we stack the layers, so all the wavelengths into one, and then we identify the trees. So we look for the center points of the trees, and we put a 0.5 meter radius in the center point of each tree, and we decided on that radius based on the fact that the trees, when we first started, were pretty small, and we didn't want to incorporate a lot of background noise like soil or other plant vegetation. So we stuck with those center points, and that was consistent throughout the study. And then we extracted the data, the NDVI and NDRE data, to kind of estimate tree vigor. So healthy plants have a high NDVI or NDRE because of their reflectance of infrared light and low reflectance of red light. So here you can see these are the equations utilized to get these vegetation indexes. NDVI utilizes near infrared and red wavelengths, while NDRE utilizes near infrared and red edge. So here you can see an example of the crew in the field with the UAV and the red edge sensor. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the plant health results. So in our first column, we have our Carambola leaf nitrogen percentages. And as you can see, for season 1, the sun hemp with manure treatment had the highest Carambola leaf nitrogen percentages, with the fallow treatment being the lowest. And then overall, we see that the velvet bean manure treatment had the highest leaf nitrogen percentage when compared to the other treatments, and also the fallow treatment there. As far as the leaf carbon to nitrogen ratios, for season 1, we see that sun hemp and the sun hemp with manure treatment had significantly lower carbon to nitrogen ratios than the rest of the treatments. I have velvet bean with manure missing a star, but this one also. And overall, with all times considered, the velvet bean with manure treatment had the lowest leaf nitrogen ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio, while the fallow treatment and the velvet bean treatment had the highest. So as for the SPAD readings, or leaf greenness, which can be related to chlorophyll content, we see that in season 2, the sun hemp treatment had the highest SPAD readings, while the fallow had the lowest. And then overall, with all times considered, the sun hemp and velvet bean with manure treatments had high SPAD readings when compared to other treatments. As far as NDVI goes, we didn't see any difference between treatments when they were grouped in this fashion as far as group by season goes. And that could be a point of oversaturation, as we can see that NDVI goes up to 1, and we can see that these values are pretty close to 1, so that may have played a factor. However, when you split the NDVI values into individual sampling times, there was significant difference at a few of these sampling times. But NDRE, on the other hand, we were able to see significant difference. During season 2, we saw that the sun hemp treated trees had higher NDRE readings than the fallow and the other treatments. And then lastly, when talking about fruit yield, we can see that in season 1, the sun hemp and velvet bean with manure treatments had the highest fruit yield. In season 2, the fallow plus manure treatment had the highest fruit yield. And then overall, without time considered, we have the fallow and manure and sun hemp having the highest fruit yield treatments. And then to break it down a little bit more over time, as we were with the soils, here is the August 18 sampling time. So this was basically at cover crop termination, and then going through season 1 and then season 2. This was right after cover crop planting, and then a month after termination, and then this was the final reading 4 months after termination. So at this August 2018 sampling time, we see that trees treated with sun hemp had the highest average leaf tissue nitrogen percentage, while the fallow treatment had the lowest, and all other treatments were kind of similar to one another. And then at that October 18 sampling time, 2 months after cover crop termination, we see that the sun hemp with manure treatment had the highest carambola leaf nitrogen percentage, and the lowest were for the fallow treatment and the velvet bean treatment. And then at this May 19 sampling time, again, this was 8 months after the first cover crop, or 9 months after the first cover crop termination, and right after planting. And here we can see that the manure treatments were all higher than those that were not treated with manure. And the fallow and manure and the sun hemp with manure had the highest carambola leaf nitrogen percent. And then when looking at NDRE more specifically, we can see at this August 18 sampling time that NDRE readings were highest for the sun hemp treatment and lowest for the fallow treatment, with all other treatments similar to one another. And then at this September 19 sampling time, 1 month after the second cover crop termination, we see that the sun hemp and the sun hemp with manure treatments had the highest average NDRE readings when compared to other treatments, while velvet bean with manure had the lowest average reading. And lastly, this December 19 sampling time, the NDRE values were highest for trees treated with sun hemp, with the second highest values in the fallow with manure treatment, and the lowest average values for that VBM, or velvet bean with manure treatment. So at sampling periods where NDRE did show difference between treatments, trees treated with sun hemp and sun hemp with manure consistently showed higher values than other, which indicates that they were possibly more vigorous than other treatments. So here I just wanted to point out the correlation by season when looking at the different indices that we measured. And I wanted to show this interesting point that in both season 1 and season 2, that the fruit yield was pretty moderately correlated to that NDRE reading, which could have promising outlook for maybe utilizing NDRE to model fruit yields in the future with more research. So to conclude, just to wrap up the soil analysis part, the sun hemp treatments consistently provided sufficient amounts of total dry matter nitrogen to supply carambola trees with necessary nutrients that they require. The poultry manure combined with sun hemp, or the SHM treatment, was most successful cover crop treatment in terms of soil organic matter and plant available nutrient contribution. And soils treated with poultry manure without the cover crop addition, the FM treatment, had quantifiable benefits to the soil throughout the 2 seasons. And this is likely a result of poultry manure addition added directly to the soil surface with more immediate impact. And also that the breakdown of organic matter isn't an instant process and can take a long time to show results. And to conclude the carambola response part, sun hemp is a good candidate for intercropping, as it can act as a windbreak and provide partial shade to trees that require this type of management strategy. And the benefits of this, plus the nutrient additions, are reflected in the nitrogen percentage, carbon to nitrogen ratios of those carambola leaves, and fruit yield throughout the study. Although the sun hemp seems to be a very effective cover crop based on our results, there's a lot of room for investigation to confirm effectiveness for fertilization strategy, and also potential negative effects based on resource competition, and also testing these cover crops with different types of fruit trees. So to gain a greater understanding of tree vigor, fruit yield, and relationship to optical sensor readings, it would be really cool to expand on this project and gain additional insight from the spectral signaling and the capacity for modeling, so possibly creating fruit yield models based on this remote sensing data. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my funding sources and everyone that contributed to this project, especially L&B Groves for letting me use their space, and UF Trek for housing me and allowing me a lot of resources, but especially the funding sources. And thank you to the GIS Center as well for always coming out and helping me with the study. And that's it. These are some pictures, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Hey, Ariel. Thank you for filling us in on some of your results. I have a question. A lot of times when plants have it too good, they don't fruit as well, or the fruits don't taste as good, etc. You counted yield, but did you have any chance to look at how the different amendments might affect the fruit quality, like the taste or the percent sugar or anything like that?
Yeah, I wasn't able to do that part of it, but it is really interesting to me because I know especially for Carambola, they do well when they're stressed, like drought stress. Sometimes farmers do actually stress their trees on purpose to have like better yield. So it would be interesting actually to see the sugar content, but I wasn't able to do that, unfortunately.
And did you, I think you looked at fruit number, right, of the trees? Or did you do that?
I didn't do fruit number, it was just weight.
Okay. Or fruit weight. So are the heavier ones bigger usually, or did you measure the size? Okay.
Just as a visual estimate, I would say usually yes. Like they're very big and like juicy. But I didn't measure like individual fruits. There was a lot of yield. The Carambola makes so much fruit. That would be like a study on its own to like really look at the fruit.
Yes, no, you did an awful lot of things. I thought it was interesting you conclude that sun hemp is important not only for its benefits to the soil, but because it can be a windbreak. Because a couple times I've tried to grow carambola in our backyard here. We live on a canal. And after a while, they don't survive. I think it's too breezy for them. So.
Yeah, the windbreak really helps for the carambola. A lot of people put bamboo, but we know that that can be an issue.
And spread.
But
Thank you.
The sun hemp works well.
If nobody else is going to ask, I have to tell you that I looked up the plants that you were adding right away. I thought, uh-oh, I see a lot of non-native crotalaria in natural areas. And I know that the velvet bean has very pickery fruit that can give you a rash and stuff, but neither are listed as exotic pest plants.
So. Yeah, the velvet bean is definitely hard to work with, and it can spread pretty easily. So that's something to be aware of as well. But I actually probably wouldn't recommend the velvet bean for farmers for fruit trees, at least, because it's pretty vigorous and it was kind of annoying to manage in the fruit grove. You know, it climbs on the trees and everything. So.
Hey, may I ask a question, Ariel? This is Chris here.
Sure.
I really enjoyed this. Very nice presentation. You have a rich data set. A lot of data in there. Difficult to pick through some of the tables. But one of the things that's occurring to me, thinking of like the real take-home message here, poultry manure seemed to be like the overriding contributor to a lot of the soil effects and even the effects on the carambola. And yet in a lot of those bar graphs, it looks, you know, you're comparing all those different treatments. So have you done any statistics to tease apart the contribution of having poultry, having a cover crop, and then the identity of the cover crop? Because you spend a lot of time discussing the identity of cover crop. But if I were looking at this and just trying briefly to see, the poultry seems to do the poultry manure seems to do the most impact across the suite of variables. And if I were a farmer, then I'd be asking, why should I even bother doing anything except a constant application of poultry manure?
Right.
Have you done any of those models to do a decomposition of variance, or a little bit more like a nested ANOVA model, two-way or something like this?
So I haven't done that yet. I'm going to be working on that for the paper publications, definitely to look more into like the factorial design of it. But it is a good point, and it's something that I discuss with my committee members to work on moving forward when we do publish the work. So definitely to draw some better conclusions, we will be looking at that. But thank you.
Yeah, I think because
Very
there's definitely that first level contribution of poultry, and then on top of that, in a few cases, having a cover crop, particularly if it's sun hemp, helps out, right?
Right.
And so I think it's there. And I totally agree with Suzanne that ultimately the thing that probably would convince people in extension would be some sort of a taste test or a sugar content or something in the quality, in addition to just yield.
Yeah,
across.
I agree too. Thank you.
So Ariel, I've seen sun hemp in the Redland a few times. Is it used for a diverse array of crops?
Yeah, it's very popular for vegetable production in the Redlands. For the farmers who do grow cover crops, it's a pretty popular one.
And do you have a sense among the farmers, like how they feel about cover crops? Do they feel it's worth the effort and it's very successful? Or?
So actually a chapter that I didn't present on, I had a whole like social science survey chapter where, you know, I interviewed farmers and I got their responses in surveys. And yeah, a lot of the farmers are definitely interested in the cover cropping. They definitely want to learn more. Nearly all the farmers that I surveyed said that they would be interested in attending extension, like to learn more about them. And that a lot of them were concerned with environmental factors like adding too much fertilizer and things like that. So they definitely had interest. A lot of them thought that cover cropping would be like economically viable for them, but they didn't really want to incorporate it if, you know, it was going to have negative effects on their plants. So I did do that part. I just didn't put it in this presentation, but it is really interesting to see the social aspect as well, because that's the most important part, right? Like if the farmers aren't going to adopt, then it's not really.
So are there some farmers with experience with these cover crops that do you feel convinced, or is there some that kind of feel like they failed using it?
There was very few farmers that had actually utilized cover crops in their fruit production systems, but actually one of the largest, one of the farmers with like a large amount of acreage did say that they had seen very good results utilizing it. So I thought that was kind of promising, you know, even though not that many people had tried it, a lot of the ones that did kind of had a good experience with it. But it really comes down to like, do you want to put the extra money into it, the extra labor, you know, to enhance your soil, because this is something that takes a long time. But that's kind of when you kind of have to start talking about, okay, well, what do you expect on the short term? So for example, if they like the idea of weed suppression or pollinator attraction or things like that, you know, that's something that you can kind of consider and be like, okay, well, this cover crop could be good for those things that you're looking for. And then if you continue this practice, you know, adding organic matter to your soil ultimately is going to give you healthier soil after years and years. So it's kind of like that type of learning curve about it.
Yeah, to get people to think in the long term, especially.
Right.
But I mean, fruit trees take a long time to grow, so.
Yeah, it's a long-term investment.
Just to add to Suzanne about the weediness, I mean, the velvet bean I see all over roadsides quite a bit, but the sun hemp, I've only seen it where people plant it basically. And sometimes it reseeds maybe on the edge of that same farm, but I don't think it's weedy at all.
Yeah, no, it's not too bad.
Yeah, I think it's super cool that it had that result. And I missed the beginning. I apologize for that. But did you talk about the cost of application of these? Are they similar? I'm just wondering why crotalaria is not more widespread in subtropical climates.
Yeah, actually, the cost of the seeds is definitely a barrier. When I went to go order the seeds to do the project at one of the local seed places, distributors, I ordered a bag of sun hemp, 50-pound bag, and a 50-pound bag of velvet bean, and it was very expensive. And I asked the seed distributor, you know, why is this so expensive? And they were like, oh, not that many people order it, so we don't like order it in bulk, basically. So that's definitely a barrier.
Is more expensive? Like the cost per acre of application, is it similar between the two?
I think the velvet bean was more expensive, actually. I think the sun hemp was a little less.
I mean, if you made this into an economic model for input to the soil and impact on the crop, then that might be another reason to choose sun hemp, because
Yeah, a good selling point.
yeah, even if it's expensive, it's cheaper than Mucuna.
Right.
Can you collect seed when you're tilling it back under? Can you get it to the point where you can collect seed for a secondary application? I know you can do that with Mucuna. I don't know with crotalaria.
I've actually never grown it to seed. I know, again, for Mucuna, it's very easy. But the sun hemp, I'm not really sure.
So Ariel, I heard that you might be going up to Gainesville for the next step of your career. Is that the case?
Yes, most likely. I'll be in Gainesville starting June 1st.
And doing a postdoc or a professor position? What's up there?
It's a postdoc in organic vegetable and cover crop, like working with cover crops and organic vegetable production, looking at nitrate recycling.
Oh, wonderful. Congrats.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Ariel. That was a great talk. I think we all enjoyed it. And good luck on your postdoc at UF.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
And we'll resume in the fall with more plant talk.
Yay, thank you.
All right.